Welcome to the part 2 of the Auditor's Report lesson. So for this lesson, we will be talking about the audit of group financial statements, the use of the work of an expert, and the other reporting considerations. So first, we have the audits of group financial statements. So in the audit of Group FS, the objectives of the auditor are to determine whether to act as the auditor of the group financial statements, to communicate clearly with component auditors about the scope and timing of their work on financial information related to components and their findings, and to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence about the financial information of the components and the consolidation process to express an opinion whether the Group FS are prepared in all material respects in accordance with applicable financial reporting framework. So first we define now the group financial statements. So these refer to the financial statements that include the financial information of more than one component. These also refer to the combined financial statements aggregating the financial information prepared by components that have no parent but are under the same control. So a component is an entity or business activity for which group or component management prepares financial information that should be included in the group financial statements. A group here refers to all the components whose financial information is included in the group FS. Component management is defined as the management responsible for preparing the financial information of a component. So the group engagement partner is responsible for the direction, supervision, and performance of the group audit engagement in compliance with the professional standards and regulatory and legal requirements, and whether the auditor's report that is issued is appropriate in the circumstances. As a result, the auditor's report on the group financial statements shall not refer to a component auditor unless required by law or regulation to include such reference because, again, the group engagement partner is responsible for the overall direction, supervision, and performance of the group audit engagement. If such reference is required by law or regulation, so we mean here that reference to the component auditor, the auditor's report shall indicate that the reference does not diminish the group engagement partners or the group engagement partners firm's responsibility for the group audit opinion. In applying PSA 220, the group engagement partner shall determine whether sufficient appropriate evidence can reasonably be expected to be obtained in relation to the consolidation process and the financial information of the components on which to base the group audit opinion. For this purpose, the group engagement team shall obtain an understanding of the group, its components, and their environments that is sufficient to identify components that are likely to be significant components. Where auditors will perform work on the financial information of such components, the group engagement partner shall evaluate whether the group engagement team will be able to be involved in the work of those component auditors to the extent necessary to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. If the group engagement partner concludes that it will not be possible for the group engagement team to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence due to restrictions imposed by group management, and the possible effect of this inability will result in a disclaimer of opinion on the group FS. The group engagement partner shall either, in the case of new management, not accept the engagement, or in the case of the continuing engagement, resign from the engagement, or where law or regulation prohibits an auditor from declining or resigning from an engagement, having performed the audit of the Group FS to the extent possible, disclaim an opinion on the Group FS. So in the screening of component auditors, when the group engagement team plans to request a component auditor to perform work on financial information of a component, the group engagement team shall also obtain understanding of the following: whether a component auditor understands and will comply with ethical requirements that are relevant to the group audit and in particular is independent, the component auditor's professional competence, whether the group engagement team will be able to be involved in the work of the component auditor to the extent necessary to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and whether the component auditor operates in a regulatory environment that actively oversees auditor. When a component auditor does not meet the independence requirements that are relevant to the group audit, or the group engagement team has serious concerns about other matters, the group engagement team shall obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence relating to the financial information of the component without requesting the component auditor to perform work on the financial information of that component. When significant risks of material misstatement of the group financial statements have been identified in a component on which a component auditor performs the work, the group engagement team shall evaluate the appropriateness of the further audit procedures to be performed to respond to the identified significant risks of material misstatement of the group financial statements. Based on its understanding of the component auditor, the group engagement team shall determine whether it is necessary to be involved in the further audit procedures. Now, the group engagement team shall communicate its requirements to the component auditor on a timely basis. The communication shall set out the work to be performed, the use to be made of that work, and the form and content of the component auditor's communication with the group engagement team. The group engagement team shall then request the component auditor to communicate matters relevant to the group engagement team's conclusion with regard to the group audit. The group engagement team shall evaluate the component auditor's communication. The group engagement team shall discuss significant matters arising from that evaluation with the component auditor, component management, or group management as appropriate, and determine whether it is necessary to review other relevant parts of the component auditor's audit documentation. If the group engagement team concludes that the work of the component auditor is insufficient, the group engagement team shall determine what additional procedures are to be performed and whether they are to be performed by the component auditor or by the group engagement team. The group engagement team shall evaluate whether sufficient appropriate evidence has been obtained from the audit procedures performed on the consolidation process and the work performed by the group engagement team and the component auditors on the financial information of the components on which to base the group audit opinion. The group engagement team shall evaluate the effect on the group audit opinion of any uncorrected misstatements either identified by the group engagement team or communicated by the component auditors, and any instances where there has been an inability to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Now let's proceed to the use of the work of an auditor's. So in our previous lessons, you already know what is an auditor's expert. So is someone, or it could be an organization that possess an expertise in a field that is other than accounting or auditing, and its work may be used by the auditor to assist him in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. For example, if the auditor needs to know how much is the value of a particular property, so he may ask the help of an assessor, okay, or someone who is knowledgeable in valuation of properties or assets. So it could also be the auditor's internal expert, who is a partner or staff, including temporary staff of the auditor's firm or a network firm, or an auditor's external expert. So the auditor's role for expressing audit opinion is not reduced by using the work of an auditor's expert. So the auditor shall evaluate whether the auditor's expert has the necessary competence, capabilities, and objectivity for the auditor's purposes. In case of an auditor's external expert, the evaluation of objectivity shall include inquiry regarding interests and relationships that may create a threat to that expert's objectivity. So if the results of the expert's work do not provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence, or if the results are not consistent with the other audit evidence, the auditor should resolve the matter by discussions with the entity and the expert, applying additional procedures, including possibly engaging another expert or modifying the auditor's report. So in using the work of an auditor's expert, so there are certain considerations. So first, we may ask, is the reference to the work of an auditor's work required by law or regulation? So if the answer is yes, indicate in the auditor's report that the reference does not reduce the auditor's responsibility for the audit opinion. If no, you're going to ask, is such reference relevant to an understanding of a modification to the auditor's opinion? So if the answer is yes, then again, you indicate in the auditor's report that the reference does not reduce the auditor's responsibility for the audit opinion. In this case, the auditor obtains permission of the expert before making such reference. And if the permission is refused, the auditor shall seek legal advice. But if the reference is not relevant to an understanding of a modification to the auditor's opinion, the auditor shall not refer to the work of an auditor's expert in an unmodified audit report. Now let's proceed to the initial audit engagements and any concerns on the opening balances. So this would be the first time that we're going to perform the audit work of a client. And of course, since this is our first time to perform an audit work in that client, we're not the one who audited the previous year's financial statements. So in this case, we're not sure if the opening balances are correct. Again, because we're not the one who audited the previous uh, year's financial statements. So what would be the considerations of the auditor? So let us define opening balances. So these are the account balances which exist at the beginning of the period. These are based upon the closing balances of the prior period and reflect the effects of transactions of the prior periods and accounting policies applied in the prior period. In an initial audit engagement, the auditor will not have previously obtained audit evidence supporting such opening balances. So in such cases, it would be a problem to the auditor if he's going to rely on the opening balances or not. Now, what will happen to the audit report if there are any problems in regards to the opening balances? So here are some situations and the type of audit opinion. So first is if the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence with regards to the opening balances, the auditor may express either qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion depending on the materiality and pervasiveness. If the opening balances contain material misstatements and the effects of which are not properly accounted for and adequately disclosed, so therefore, the auditor shall express a qualified or adverse opinion. If there is inconsistent application of the current period's accounting policies to the opening balances and change has not been properly accounted for and adequately disclosed, so again, it can either be qualified opinion or adverse opinion. If the prior period auditor gave a modified report and modification remained relevant and material to the current period, then modify the opinion as appropriate. Next, we will talk about the dual dated audit report. So why is it that there's a dual date, or dual date means there are two dates in an audit report? So the dual dating is related to the subsequent events. So if you can recall, we have two types of subsequent events. So subsequent events are those that happened after the financial statement date, but before the approval of the financial statements. So again, there are two types of subsequent events. We have the type 1 subsequent events, which are the adjusting events, and we have the type 2 subsequent events, which are the non-adjusting events. So in relation to the subsequent events, there are two options on how to date the report. So you can dual date the report, meaning there are two dates that would be stated in the audit report, or you can date the report as of the later date, which is the date of the subsequent event and the completion of the audit procedures related to the subsequent event. So the first option here is to dual date the report. So when we say dual date the report, there will be two dates that will be presented, or it will be stated in the audit reports. For example, you have here the pro forma, the date of the auditor's report, then you have except as to note Y, which is as of the date of completion of audit procedures restricted to amendment described in note Y. So let's put some figures in this statement. So for example, February 16, 2020, this is our date of auditor's report, except for note 46, which is as of March 1, 2020. So there's a particular note wherein there is a subsequent event that is related to March 1. So in here, if you're going to identify another date, which is a later date, aside from the original date of the auditor's report, this would indicate that the auditor limits his responsibility for subsequent events to the specific event referred to in the note. So therefore, the efforts of the auditor in the additional audit procedures related to subsequent procedures are only confined or limited on that particular event that is described in the note. So all other things, or all other events, they are not included in the procedures of the auditor. But if the auditor will use the second option, which is dating the report, as of the later date, which is the later date is the date of the subsequent event. So in the previous slide, we have March 1. So if you're going to date the audit report as of March 1 and not put two dates, so what will happen to the auditor's responsibility? So the auditor's responsibility for subsequent events is extended to the later date. So all other subsequent events would be part of the auditor's responsibility, not only for that specific event that was supposed to be the reason why you need to decide if you're going to dual date the report or not. So since you have placed a later date, so kasali na yung ibang mga subsequent events to your audit procedures. The subsequent events review procedures with respect to the period after the balance sheet date would also be extended up to the later date. So, masasali na yung iba. Unlike if you're going to dual date the report, wherein the audit procedures and the subsequent events review would be confined only or limited only to that specific subsequent event. But if you're going to date it as of the later date, so makarga na yung ibang subsequent events. So you have to take note that it is not acceptable to label the note as unaudited or as not covered by the auditor's report. The audited note describing the subsequent event may contain unaudited financial information such as pro forma data giving effect to the event as if it had occurred at the balance sheet date. Thus, although a note describing a subsequent event may include unaudited information that is appropriately labeled, the note describing the event is not marked as unaudited. Next would be the reissuance of the financial statements. So when financial statements are reissued, for example, in reports filed with the SEC or other regulatory agencies, events might have occurred subsequent to the original issuance of the financial statements that require disclosure in the reissued financial statements to keep them from being misleading. Events that occur between the release of the original audit report and the subsequent reissuance of that report do not result in adjustment to the financial statements unless the events meet the criteria for the correction of the error. Now, how do we date the reissued report? So, the period of concern here for the reissued report is between the date of the auditor's report and the date of FS issuance. So, if it is a type 1 event, regardless if it meets the criteria for the correction of that error or not, but as long as it requires disclosure, you're going to dual date the reissued report. If it is a type 2 event that requires disclosure, so the important denominator here is there is disclosure. The subsequent event may be disclosed in a separate note to the reissued FS captioned events unaudited subsequent to the date of the report of the independent auditor, and you're going to carry the date of the original report. Now let's proceed to the last part of today's lesson. So we have the other reporting considerations. So when the client is offering securities to the public, the auditor should consider any legal and related requirements applicable to the auditor in all jurisdictions in which the securities are being offered. So this situation refers to the client which sells the shares of stock in a public exchange market. So we have, for example, the Philippine Stock Exchange. Another area of consideration by the auditor is if there are other information in documents containing audited financial statements. So for example, in an annual report, which would be issued by an entity on an annual basis, which includes the audited FS together with the auditor's report, could also include other financial and non-financial information. So these financial and non-financial information, other than the FS and auditor's report, which is included in the document containing audited FS and auditor's report thereon, is called as the other information. So what are other examples of other information? We have report by management or those charged with governance on operations, financial summaries or highlights, employment data, planned capital expenditures, financial ratios, names of officers and directors, or selected quarterly data. So what would be the area of concern for the auditor with relation to this other information? Now, the auditor should read that other information in order to identify material inconsistencies with the audited FS. So, he has to ensure that there are no material inconsistencies. Why is it that there will be material inconsistency? Because the other information may contain different statements with that of what was presented or what was discussed in the audited financial statements. So there may be contradicting statements. So this may result to a doubt on the audit conclusions that are drawn from the audit evidence previously obtained and could possibly uh, affect the basis for the auditor's opinion on the financial statements. So that's the end of our lesson today. I hope you have learned something about the auditor's report with regards to the other reporting considerations. So see you in our next lesson.